But what I'd like to lay out is something of a paradox. In spite of this safety record, the technology is under a heavy cloud of political and social suspicion, and in many countries it's under a heavy blanket of regulation. I'd like to lay out one probable scenario for the future spread of agricultural GMOs. And my own opinion on this has changed in the last couple of years. 2 years ago, I would have said, I would have given you a scenario based upon different regions of the world. I would have said, well, the technology is moving ahead very quickly in the Western Hemisphere, led by the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Brazil. It's moving ahead as well in the most capable countries of Asia, the developing countries of Asia, including China and India. It's not moving fast at all in Africa. It's lagging way behind in Africa, but that's because Africa is so closely tied by culture, by history, by trade, by foreign assistance influence to Europe, and Europe isn't moving forward at all. That would have been my assessment 2 years ago. And that approach still makes some sense, but what I'm seeing now is a pattern that may be a little less based on region and based more on the different uses that we have for genetically engineered agricultural crop plants. What I see now is three largely separate futures. One future for genetically engineered crops that are used for industrial purposes, such as insect-resistant cotton. A second future for genetically engineered crops that are fed to animals, particularly hybrid yellow maize and soybeans. And then a third future for genetically engineered crops that go for direct human food consumption. What I see is a future where genetically engineered industrial crops, like cotton, will be universally used, and they'll be very widely grown as well, perhaps everywhere except some African countries and Europe. For genetically engineered feed crops, like yellow maize or soybeans, these will be consumed by animals almost everywhere, and they'll also be widely grown, at least beyond Europe and beyond Africa. Livestock industries in Europe already import these products. They're not widely grown in Europe. This is the future I see for genetically engineered feed crops. But for genetically engineered varieties of food crops, like wheat, rice, potato, white maize, or fruits and vegetables, there may be little of this consumed at all anywhere. I see a future in which direct human consumption of genetically engineered food crops may shrink from the low level of today to nearly zero. And this would be, for me, a deeply disappointing outcome. It would represent a colossal loss of opportunity. But three events over the last 2 years have suggested to me that we might actually be moving in this direction. One of those events was a decision in the spring of 2010 by the government of India to place an indefinite moratorium on the commercial release of a genetically engineered variety of eggplant, BT brinjal. The Indian Environment Minister who put this moratorium in place could not point to any specific evidence of risk. The technology had been carefully reviewed for several years by the authoritative National Biosafety Committee in India, the Genetic Engineering Advisory Committee, and it received a technical approval from that committee, but the environment minister stopped it anyway without pointing to any specific evidence of risk. He wanted more studies. The second event I would point to is a decision by China in the spring of 2011 to pull back from an expected commercial release of genetically engineered rice. In April 2011, a senior Chinese Environment Ministry official at a prominent forum announced that Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, who had previously been an outspoken supporter of agricultural biotechnology, had now come to believe that greater caution was in order. And a month or two after that, one disappointed official in the Chinese Agricultural Ministry told a newspaper that genetically engineered rice might not be commercialized now in China for another 5 to 10 years. The third event was the success of anti-GMO activists in the United States just this last spring in placing a mandatory GMO labeling measure on the ballot in California. It will be voted on 2 weeks from yesterday. We don't know if it's going to pass. Support for this measure has been falling. The latest poll I saw, though, gave supporters for this proposition, it's called Prop 37, 48%, and opponents 40%. We don't know how much more that's going to shrink between now and Election Day. But if this measure does pass, it will eliminate the United States as an example of a country that sells GMO foods for direct human consumption unlabeled. This will make it far more difficult for the United States government or for private industry to tell developing countries in Asia or in Africa that mandatory labeling for GMO foods really isn't necessary. We don't do it. You don't have to do it. That message will no longer apply. This will accelerate what we're already seeing in the developing world, which is a spread of mandatory labeling requirements for GM foods that are essentially impossible to implement in poor countries where so much of the food supply is bought and sold unpackaged or packaged but completely unlabeled. In countries such as these, a strict labeling requirement for example, GMO maize or GMO rice, the only way to comply with such a strict mandatory labeling requirement would be not to have any GMO foods in the market to begin with, which is actually the way the European Union has de facto complied with its very strict GMO labeling requirement. And interestingly, the California ballot measure is more demanding than the European requirement. The European requirement mandates a label if there's more than 0.9% of a GMO present in a food, even if it's a GMO that's been approved as safe. If it's there, you have to put a label on the package. The California measure would require a label not if there's more than 0.9%, but if there's more than 0.5%. And in a few years it would go to zero tolerance. This is an astonishingly strict requirement, going well beyond the Europeans in its ambition. If the California measure passes, some advocates for GMOs are still hopeful. They say, well, the Food and Drug Administration will intervene. They wouldn't allow one state like California to have one labeling requirement and the rest of the country to have different labeling requirements. Somehow the federal government would be empowered to correct this malfunction. Others say, well, eventually the federal courts will intervene, and indeed a state ballot issue in Vermont that would have mandated labels on BST milk was overturned by a federal court of appeals some years ago. Others say, well, it's nothing to worry about. Excuse me. The food companies will just go ahead and voluntarily put labels on everything. And so then consumers, they won't be tempted to make an invidious choice against GE crops, thank you, because just about everything, unless it's certified organic, will be GE. But there's another foreseeable outcome, and this is the one that I think is as probable as any. In an effort to avoid a stigmatizing GMO label, food companies may reformulate their products away from the use of any genetically engineered ingredients. And rather than trying to do that just for the California market, since that would be awkward, they'll do it for their product lines nationwide. But if this happens, it won't be as revolutionary as it sounds, which is one reason it might happen. It will only be the latest and the most conspicuous move in the United States away from putting genetically engineered food for direct human consumption on the market. We have to realize that the United States is not exactly a cornucopia of genetically engineered foods. We had genetically engineered potato on the market back in the 1990s, but in 1999, food service companies decided they didn't want to invite criticism for having genetically engineered French fries, and so they asked their potato suppliers to supply only non-genetically engineered potatoes, and this genetically engineered potato variety disappeared from the market 13 years ago. In the United States, we have never placed onto the market genetically engineered wheat or genetically engineered rice. The reason given is, oh, well, we're worried about rejection by consumers in markets abroad. But let's face it, we're also worried about rejection by consumers in the United States. And we do have genetically engineered corn on the market, and some of that goes for direct food use in chips or in breakfast cereal. But notice that the food companies have never put genetically engineered popcorn on the market. They're very sensitive to risks of consumer rejection when it comes to GMO foods for direct human use. So the California ballot issue would only be pushing this existing pattern one step farther by driving food companies away from using genetically engineered corn and soy in processed foods as well. And that's mostly corn for things like chips and flakes, or it's corn oil or soy oil in packaged foods. Now, one reason this could happen once again is it wouldn't represent such a massive change for U.S. agriculture either. For corn producers in the United States, currently only 12% of U.S. corn goes for direct food use. The rest goes for biofuels, for other industrial uses, or for animal feed. So if this measure came into place today, only 12% of U.S. corn would have to be labeled. Making this 12% of U.S. corn production non-genetically engineered to avoid the label might not be too difficult. Some of this 12% is already organic and non-GE, or certified to be non-GE even if it's not organic. And for soy producers, currently 98% of U.S. soy production goes for for animal feed. So we're already using the two most prominent genetically engineered crops out there, corn and soy, predominantly for non-food uses. The third prominent crop, Bt cotton, is an industrial crop. So our agricultural system has already embraced genetically engineered crops primarily for industrial and animal feed uses, not for food. Now, you'd have to replace the soybean oil and the corn oil, and that would be awkward, that would be difficult, but non-GE sources of oil could be found, and perhaps industrial uses for the GE oil in biodiesel production could be found as well. So if the use of genetically engineered crops for direct human food use did come to a complete end in the United States through a voluntary decision by food companies to try to avoid the GE label, it wouldn't be such a dramatic change from current circumstances. But I'm not saying that the damage from this outcome would be minimum. The damage would be for the United States acceptable at the outset, but it would grow with every year. It would grow with every loss of the next generation of improved genetically engineered food crop technology that would perhaps now not even come into creation because of a withdrawal of investment from technologies in that area. The opportunities lost by not allowing the application of genetic engineering for food staples, for fruits and vegetables, would continue to grow year after year. And here's the real problem. For developing countries, where very little of agricultural production today goes for animal feed or for biofuels, where so many poor farmers are engaged in efforts to produce rice and wheat and potatoes and white maize and other staple food crops, farmers that are in serious need of improvements for their crops that can perhaps best be provided in some cases through genetic engineering. For these farmers, the loss over time would be considerable. So the voters in California wouldn't be hurt as usual, but farmers in poor countries would, as usual. I'll stop there.